Good morning, everyone. Buen día, buenos días. Vamos a comenzar con esta presentación que, como ya decía Ana García, se titula Con las manos en la masa. Y me gustaría que en el chat comenzaran si conocen una traducción a su lengua materna de este dicho, con las manos en la masa. Si lo pueden escribir en el chat, ¿cómo dirían con las manos en la masa en inglés o en francés o en otro idioma? Que pueda ser su idioma materno, pero también puede ser otro idioma que hayan aprendido después. Entonces, todo esto para rescatar lo que Aline nos estaba contando ya de la importancia del plurilingüismo, la pluriculturalidad y de que todas las lenguas importan y no solamente esa lengua meta, el target language que les estamos enseñando a nuestros estudiantes. Entonces, por ahí, si pueden poner Music to My Ears, nos dice Annik, Music to My Ears, con las manos en la masa, ¿o era otro comentario por ahí?
Yo creo que otro.
Era otro, ¿verdad? Ok, vale, no hay problema. Entonces, Adriana es candidata a doctora en OISI, que es uno de los institutos más importantes en estudios de educación, y quisimos incorporar toda esta teoría de la cual allá en OISI son expertos y ponerla a la práctica, porque este es también uno de los temas, uno de los debates, ¿no? Tienes un estudio muy bonito y mucha teoría, pero después, ok, a ver, con las manos en la masa, ¿cómo lo haces en una universidad con tantos estudiantes, con tantos profesores, con todos los recursos limitados? Entonces, Adriana me escribió un correo electrónico y se presentó, me dijo, soy Adriana, me gustaría hacer esto en tus clases de español. Y al principio, cuando escuché la idea y me puse a pensar, bueno, ¿cómo lo haría en español 100? ¿Cómo lo haría en español intermedio y avanzado con tanta gente? Le dije, me gusta el estudio, todo lo que estás haciendo, pero vamos a controlarlo un poco, vamos a hacer un piloto. Entonces, el día de hoy les vamos a contar en dónde lo hicimos. Hablaremos de todo este bagaje teórico, pero un poco ya limitado, porque Aline ya afortunadamente habló de mucho de esto y nos va a ahorrar tiempo, de la metodología, de lo que encontramos y del por qué recomendaríamos hacer esto en una clase de español, de francés o del idioma que ustedes enseñen. La presentación va a ser a veces en español, a veces en inglés, porque vivimos, por lo menos Adriana y yo vivimos en una sociedad anglófona donde el inglés está completamente alrededor de nosotros y hablamos inglés todos, todo el tiempo, ¿no? Entonces también rescatamos la idea de lo que es el plurilingüismo y la pluriculturalidad. Así que, Adriana, te cedo la palabra.
Gracias. Bueno, creo que ya Dr. Germain Rutherford explicó bien, así que qué es el proyecto de Linkager, cuáles son las metas. Somos más de 20 investigadoras que colaboramos a nivel global. Y me gustaría apuntar que la herramienta digital que salió como producto de este proyecto, Light, la utilizamos en nuestro estudio. Y ayuda no solamente para como un portafolio electrónico, sino además como una herramienta para autoevaluación para los estudiantes. Creo que no tengo que explicarlo todo porque ya todos conocemos, Juan Carlos, si me pasas, por favor. Okay. Del marco teórico también creo que nos dio una excelente, nadie mejor que Dr. Germain para explicar un poco cuál es el marco teórico que respalda nuestro estudio. Pero voy a añadir cosas, aunque ella mencionó que es el plurilingüismo, el pluriculturalismo en el que se basa este enfoque pedagógico que propone el marco común europeo de referencia, que es el CFR. La propuesta metodológica, como ya ella dijo, se llama Action Oriented Approach. En español es el enfoque orientado a la acción, donde el estudiante es un agente social que es autónomo, aprende haciendo, siempre va a producir algo tangible que mostrar, que enseñar. Me gustaría añadir que entonces, ¿cuál es la diferencia entre este enfoque orientado a la acción y el enfoque por tareas con el que estamos tan acostumbrados, el task-based, del que estamos acostumbrados. No es lo mismo. Task-based ve la comunicación como el objetivo y la meta. Aquí es la acción, vas a ejecutar algo, y la comunicación lingüística es solamente el medio. Se utilizan todas las competencias generales. Voy a añadir esto que no se discutió antes. Desde el punto de vista del marco teórico, del CFR, el Official Language Proficiency, que sería el dominio de la lengua, se califica por el uso de competencias generales para lograr las competencias comunicativas del lenguaje, las que conocemos, que son la lingüística, la sociolingüística, la pragmática. En eso siempre se ha hecho en las clases. Ahorita lo que se va a involucrar es al estudiante, el conocimiento declarativo, que es saber, el saber hacer, las habilidades prácticas, el saber ser, valores, conocimiento de sí mismo como estudiante, como agente social, como un individuo que es autónomo en su aprendizaje. Y por supuesto el saber aprender, que es pues habilidades de conocimiento, habilidades de cómo aprender, de reflexionar, etcétera. Todo esto con actividades comunicativas que utilizan estrategias comunicativas. Como decía Dr. Germain, antes hablábamos de la comprensión auditiva, del habla, la lectura, la escritura. Ahorita hablamos de recepción, producción, interacción y mediación para ambas, como actividad y como estrategia. Recepción no es solamente cuando yo escucho y pongo en el laboratorio y escucho el audio para practicar mi comprensión auditiva, sino cuando escucho a alguien, pero también cuando leo su email, cuando leo el texto con el emoji. Hay una recepción, hay un mensaje que debo interpretar. Producción. La producción no es solamente cuando hablo, no es solamente oral, es escrita, es también aquel mensajito que mando en el teléfono, etcétera, que es distinto y parecido en cada lengua, y así. Interacción no es solamente la que conocemos en persona, ahorita tenemos el medio con el que nos comunicamos y seguimos interactuando, y mediación, que es importantísimo porque mediamos conceptos, mediamos significados, mediamos mensajes. Si alguien llama por teléfono y tengo que decir a mi compañero qué fue el mensaje que dejaron, estoy mediando. Y cuando hago una traducción, hay mediación. Entonces hay muchísimas actividades del lenguaje que son necesarias para lograr la obtención de algo concreto, en este año de vivir en la lengua, en realidad, vivir en la lengua. Para todo esto, por supuesto, exploramos una dimensión pluricultural, como se habló antes, ya hablamos un poquito de toda la investigación teórica y sociolingüística que hay detrás. La necesidad de reflexión no solamente en la conciencia o lo que hablamos de metalinguistic awareness, sino además reflexión personal para poder ejecutarse como un individuo que pertenece a una sociedad en la que debe comunicarse, y que la lengua es un proceso de vida y no un curso. Entonces esa es la primera base de nuestro marco teórico, y la segunda es el Community Engaged Language Learning, que el doctor Rocha nos va a explicar a más detalle.
Gracias, Adriana. Entonces, este estudio lo hicimos en una clase que se llama Accelerated Spanish Through Community Engaged Learning. Es un curso de un año dividido en 2 semestres, el semestre del otoño y el semestre de invierno. En la primera parte del curso, en el semestre del otoño, nos enfocamos a cubrir las estructuras gramaticales, a darles las herramientas a nuestros estudiantes para que se puedan comunicar en la segunda parte de una forma más efectiva. Aunque, como siempre les he dicho a mis estudiantes, yo no tengo una varita mágica y no es como que van a aprender completamente a dominar la gramática. Eso les corresponde a ellos tomar esas herramientas que uno les da. ¿Cómo las vamos a hacer? Hay varias formas, y una de estas formas es a través de Community Engaged Learning y Action Oriented Approach. Entonces, los estudiantes en esta clase tienen la oportunidad de practicar la lengua, pero también de trabajar con socios comunitarios y adentrarse a lo que son algunas de las problemáticas de la comunidad de habla hispana de la ciudad de Toronto. Participan en proyectos como saber cómo elaborar chocolate artesanal que se trae de Latinoamérica a Toronto, y aquí les enseñan cómo hacer todo eso. Algunas veces se les dan las instrucciones en español, pero algunas veces no. Y también ir desmitificando la idea de que todo tiene que ser en la lengua meta, porque eso es imposible también, ¿no? Y rescatamos aquí la idea del plurilingüismo y pluriculturalismo. Todas las lenguas, todas las culturas son válidas en nuestro salón de clases. Ahora con la situación de la pandemia también, yo quise hacer un experimento. Quise hacer un curso asincrónico, porque la mayoría de los cursos eran cursos sincrónicos, cursos en vivo, como en este momento estamos llevando a cabo nuestra clase. Entonces, de alguna forma se intentó replicar esta experiencia del salón presencial a una clase virtual, pero creo que todos nos dimos cuenta que son dos cosas diferentes. El hecho de que uno dé una clase virtual en vivo, sincrónica, no quiere decir que va a salir de la misma forma como es una clase presencial. El tiempo se va rapidísimo, por ejemplo, solo por mencionar uno de los aspectos. Entonces, el Community Engaged Learning lo venimos haciendo desde el año 2017. El año anterior, previo a la pandemia, esta clase la ofrecí en persona. Los socios comunitarios venían a la clase, los estudiantes se involucraban en los proyectos de estos socios comunitarios, pero, oh sorpresa, después llega la pandemia y nos cambia todo el paradigma y tuve que reinventarme, como ustedes, mis colegas, también tuvieron que hacerlo, y como ustedes, estudiantes, tuvieron que hacerlo. Así que es aquí donde Adriana llega justo en el momento indicado, me habla de este proyecto y se me ocurre que lo podríamos hacer en mi clase de español acelerado, pero de una forma asincrónica. ¿Por qué? Porque los proyectos que les vamos a narrar un poquito más adelante necesitan tiempo, los estudiantes necesitan tiempo para trabajarlos, no es algo que se puede hacer en 20 minutos y a ver, ahora se van a los breakout rooms y hacen esto. No, los estudiantes tienen que desarrollar la autonomía y esto es algo que nunca debemos de olvidar. Nosotros solamente tendemos este puente para que nuestros estudiantes pasen a través de él y puedan llegar a ser estudiantes autónomos y se desempeñen en la lengua. Entonces, ahora te cedo la palabra, Adriana.
Muy bien, estaba pensando que explicaste muy bien esto de que yo traje un estudio, pero también tuvimos que añadirle un problema, planteamos un problema nuevo que teníamos que abordar, que era el modo asíncrono del curso. Entonces, un proyecto de estos, porque estamos basándonos, ya dijimos, en los escenarios que habían hecho en LinkedIn, están hechos para pues, clases en presenciales. Ahora teníamos el reto de cómo llevar esto no solamente al aprendizaje en línea, sino además que fuese asíncrono, donde la gente no llegó, los estudiantes no alcanzaron a llegar a Toronto porque estábamos en pleno confinamiento. Entonces, estamos ahorita, además de los retos que significa el aprendizaje en línea síncrono, estamos hablando de usos horarios, de problemas pues logísticos. Entonces, eso más o menos me da una introducción a cómo implementamos esta metodología. Entonces van a ver en práctica cómo funciona. El doctor Rocha eligió 4 escenarios, como le explicó bien, se divide en 2 semestres. El primer semestre fue un escenario individual que está basado en el catálogo de LinkedIn y que tuvimos que adaptar, completamente adaptar, es casi reinvención del escenario, porque hay que tomar en consideración las necesidades particulares de este salón, de esta nueva modalidad y de estos estudiantes que vienen de todas partes del mundo y de los objetivos curriculares, por supuesto. Después seguimos con un segundo escenario que también era individual y sirvió un poquito como un calentamiento para estos proyectos que, como dijo doctor Rocha, no son proyectos donde podemos váyase al breakout room y trabaje 20 minutos. No todo el mundo empieza desde el mismo punto. Nuestro aprendizaje en las lenguas, yo puedo tener conocimiento de una cosa que mi compañero no. Y ¿cómo podemos trabajar juntos? Bueno, a lo mejor yo me brinco esta parte porque yo ya me la sé, pero tú la revisas, etcétera. Entonces es un proceso, en eso nos referimos muy autónomo. Los dos siguientes proyectos que se hicieron en la segunda parte del semestre se hicieron en grupo o en parejas, y esto sirvió como introducción al Community Engagement Component del curso. Y esto fue uno de los grandes pues, logros de este estudio. Hablé antes de que utilizamos Light, ya sabemos por qué, los 4 pilares de Light, que es la plataforma que encontramos a la izquierda en la pantalla, puse ahí el logo. Los 4 pilares son el Action Oriented Approach, la tecnología, que ahorita pues base importantísima para un curso en línea, las reflexiones holísticas y el plurilingüismo, como se habló antes. Pero yo quería destacar que no es necesario solamente usar Light. Nosotros nos mudamos a Crickers para entregar tareas, para mantener el espacio, ¿cómo se dice? Para tener más control, como dijo el profesor Rocha, sobre los alumnos, sobre lo que decían, no añadir nuevas tecnologías a estudiantes que ya están un poco sometidos a muchísimas tecnologías. Esto nos lleva a cómo se desarrollaron los escenarios. Tuvimos 2 fases. Una fue la del desarrollo de la tarea que llamamos escenario, que es el proyecto, ¿verdad? Y una segunda parte que fue algo que descubrimos que era necesario para un curso en línea asíncrono, que fue el desarrollo de una herramienta pedagógica diseñada, obvio, con el estudiante en mente, destinada al estudiante, y que la llamé paso a paso. La primera parte, como ya dije, el profesor va al catálogo de LinkedIn, elige, ¿cómo se dice? Compagina los objetivos curriculares del curso, las necesidades y elige, ¿verdad? Con el catálogo. Después pasamos a la parte de adaptación, y aquí fue el gran estudio, el gran experimento. Tenemos, como ya dije, un curso asíncrono, pero el curso asíncrono cambia el rol del profesor, y eso lo teníamos que tomar en cuenta en la creación de este escenario. Una cosa es trabajar en un escenario en el paso 1 y estar en clase, ¿verdad? Y back.
Nos queda un minuto, Adriana. Ya
Oh,
tenemos que
sorry,
terminar.
no
Sí,
sabía. Perdón, ok.
Lo termino yo, si quieres. Lo termino aquí. Entonces, Adriana nos habla de la necesidad de adaptar estos proyectos, este catálogo. No es como, y les vamos a poner el enlace en el chat. Ustedes lo pueden utilizar, pueden ver los proyectos, pero tienen que adaptarlos al contenido de su clase. Y esa es una de las cosas primordiales si es que quieren llevar a cabo el Action Oriented Approach. Aquí está un poco de los proyectos que los estudiantes desarrollaron. Por motivo de tiempo, obviamente no vamos a poder hablar mucho de esto, pero uno de esos proyectos fue el blog de idiomas, donde los estudiantes escogían hablar de un idioma que les llamaba la atención, y muchos de ellos hablaron de su primer idioma. Entonces nos exponían las razones del por qué era importante aprender Punjabi, Hindi, etcétera, etcétera. Y un poco de las conclusiones aquí, en base a la perspectiva del profesor. La pandemia nos vino a cambiar, sí, el esquema, la manera de hacer las cosas, pero esto ha sido algo positivo. Podemos ahora reevaluar nuestras prácticas de enseñanza, le da al estudiante y al profesor también un poco más de autonomía en poder hacer las cosas y ensuciarse y manos a la masa. Vamos a utilizar esta lengua que estamos aprendiendo para hacer cosas tangibles y que los profesores y los demás estudiantes puedan ver y se pueda aprender haciéndose esto. Learning by doing, explicándoles también a los estudiantes de una forma sutil el por qué hacemos lo que hacemos en las clases, y no nada más de, a ver, ahora vas a hacer ejercicio 20 de la página 100 y ya. Esto a los estudiantes no les dice nada. Y se nos acabó el tiempo. Muchísimas gracias. Gracias.
Gracias. Siento mucho.
Adriana, no pasa nada, esto es normal. El proyecto realmente es interesante y sería maravilloso poder escuchar más, pero esperemos que haya más tiempo durante las preguntas. Bueno, vamos a pasar con la siguiente presentación. Si os parece bien, haremos las 3 presentaciones que corresponden a esta primera sesión y al final habrá 15 minutos para preguntas para las 3 sesiones. La siguiente persona a presentar es Annik Bilodeau. Annik ha sido lecturer en el departamento de Spanish and Latin American Studies en la Universidad de Waterloo desde 2017. Sus áreas de interés incluyen Latinoamérica, voy a decirlo en inglés porque es como me lo envió, Latin American Intellectual History, Cosmopolitanism and Visual Culture and Street Art. Ella enseña todos los niveles de cursos de lengua en español y sus teaching research interests are metacognition, motivation and self-regulation. La presentación de hoy se titula Assessing the Benefits of Collaborative Reading to Mitigate Foreign Language Reading Anxiety in Advanced Spanish Courses. Adelante, Annik.
Gracias, Ana. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here today on such a beautiful sunny morning. So as Ana just said, well, most of you know me as a specialist in Latin American literature and visual culture, street art, but I very recently, like August of this year, started doing research in ELE. So I received a LIGHT grant, so a Learning, Innovation, Teaching Enhancement grant from the University of Waterloo to conduct a study in my classroom and develop new teaching methods. So I am currently running this study with 2 research assistants, one of which is Jessica Ross. I will be presenting with her today. She's a 2nd year psychology PhD candidate. So here we go. Most language instructors would agree with Borges that paradise will be a kind of library. My 3rd year advanced Spanish students, however, tend to see the readings of writings such as Borges' short stories as a spirit-breaking task. Reading real-life materials, often for the first time in their language learning journey, exposes students to new vocabulary and expressions, new ways to structure texts, and new cultural worldviews. While advanced students expect to be exposed to such materials in order to achieve fluency in the target language, they still experience considerable struggle when approaching them, both linguistically and emotionally. To mitigate these negative effects of reading and engaging with texts geared towards native speakers, I have developed a project that introduces a collaborative reading strategy in the Spanish classroom to study its effect on students' reading comprehension skills and anxiety levels. In the literature, a collaborative reading is understood as students reading together. That's the most basic form. Modalities vary. The work can be performed asynchronously or synchronously, and the size of groups varies. Students can read in pairs or as a whole class. They are not expected to read aloud, only to read together. And now that we have talked about the Linked framework, I'm tempted to add, as long as they read together, they can converse about the texts in their native language. As long as they speak, it's good. So in the study, we have chosen to have students read synchronously in groups of 2. The original plan was to run the study in my Advanced 1 course this fall, but a low sample of 7 participants made us change our plans. So we are piloting this term with my 3rd year students to perfect the design, and we will run the study next semester with my group of 2nd year students. We are expecting between 35 and 40 participants in 2nd year. The pilot studies a small sample of 7 students who have been divided into 2 groups, a collaborative reading group of 4 students, so 2 pairs, and 3 students performing the individual reading. My hypothesis is that synchronous collaborative reading, by addressing motivational and affective factors, will contribute to lowering student foreign language reading anxiety levels, therefore increasing their reading comprehension. So today, Jessica and I will present the original study design and the modifications we implemented to the pilot after starting recruitment. We did run into some problems during recruitment, and I am interested to learn how other ELE researchers have handled similar challenges. I'm also interested in feedback on the study design itself, as it can still be modified for the winter study. But before moving to the actual study design, we need to understand why students need a bit of extra help with reading comprehension this term. Remediation measures are especially important for this year's cohort of third-year students. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, most of the students currently enrolled in SPAN 301A, or Advanced Spanish, took second-year Spanish fully online last year, and measures implemented by the University of Waterloo impacted some aspects of their learning. To be fair, in the middle of a crisis, these measures needed to be taken to ensure students' physical and mental well-being, but they still affected language students' progress. Unlike other Canadian universities, Waterloo elected to limit synchronous instruction so that students' grades and performance would not rely on the quality of their internet connection or from which time zone they were studying. More specifically, in my Spanish courses, contact time, synchronous contact time, went from 4 hours to 30 minutes a week. So we elected to keep a 30-minute tutorial mandatory, but attendance to synchronous class meetings with me, so the so-called lectures, attendance was neither mandatory nor graded. So many students, many second-year students simply did not attend any. And the students who did attend the non-mandatory meetings were negatively impacted too, since contact time was reduced by 87.5%. Priorities also shifted. As we know, reading is often labeled an individual task that students can do at home, which explains why it is sometimes sidelined in synchronous Spanish classes. It comes as no surprise then that Waterloo's expectations to reduce the coursework by 15% led to a diminution in the time dedicated to reading and to reading comprehension activities, both synchronously and asynchronously. Reading activities were the first one to go. We removed the majority of literary text and reading quizzes from the program to focus on consolidating vocabulary, grammatical knowledge, and oral fluency. This lack of exposure affected students' reading comprehension skills, but also their cultural competences. Limiting mandatory synchronous instruction time and removing reading activities means that students enrolled in third year this semester are not at the same level as students from previous cohorts. And yet, now that we are slowly going back to normal with more in-person teaching, with more contact hours, students are still expected to reach the same program outcomes, namely a low B2, low C1 level by the end of this winter term. And they are starting with some of them a high B1, low B2, and basically I need to have them reach one more level by the end of the year. So to summarize, students usually struggle with comprehension, with reading comprehension in third year, and it has proven to be worse this year. By introducing a synchronous collaborative reading strategy with these students, I hope to mitigate their anxiety and help them reach the desired outcome of a C1 plus level in a less challenging way. Let's now move to the literature review. While one might expect speaking to elicit the highest anxiety levels in learners, surprisingly, reading is where advanced students tend to struggle the most. And instructors might be the ones responsible, as a lot of us tend to spend more time on spoken practice. The apprehension students feel when approaching foreign texts is called foreign language reading anxiety, or FLRA. FLRA is like a snowball rolling down a hill. It starts small and gets increasingly bigger as time passes. At a very basic level, FLRA can make it harder for students to recall elements of a reading, but it can also affect their engagement with a course and their very motivation, which ultimately can affect their class attendance. A lack of motivation, a lack of engagement, generally lead to a slowing down of their development of speaking and writing too, as students cannot really engage with their readings, poor grades, and in some extreme cases, in pre and mid-task anxiety attacks. In some, FLRA starts a domino effect that impacts students' overall performance, emotional state, and capacity to meet the learning outcomes. In the past 4 years of teaching advanced Spanish courses, I have noticed that the jump from intermediate to advanced is daunting for students, especially reading non-learner-centered materials or real-life materials. In theory, students are ready to understand these texts linguistically and to interpret them culturally, but in practice, the FLRA they experience stunts their development and performance. The main sources of FLRA are different scripts, unfamiliar topics, and self-perceived capacity to handle a task. For most students in my courses, I would say that unfamiliar topics should not be an issue. Most of the texts chosen deal with issues known to students, and when new concepts or historical periods are introduced, they are contextualized in depth in pre-reading activities that draw parallels between the Hispanic context and students' realities. Ultimately, the FLRA students' experience does not appear to be due to a lack of Spanish knowledge or cultural competence, but to their own perception of their reading comprehension skills and with the type of materials to which they have been exposed in previous courses, especially in second-year courses. As we know, foreign language learners interact with two types of reading materials. Whereas learner-centered texts are created with L2 learners' skills in mind, non-learner-centered texts are written for native speakers. At the University of Waterloo, in both beginner and intermediate courses, students are mostly exposed to learner-centered texts, and in advanced Spanish courses, only non-learner-centered texts are used, as it is taught concurrently with our Introduction to Spanish American Literature course. In their last year of learning the Spanish language, students are expected to progress from a B2, understanding the main ideas of a text, to a C1+ level, recognizing implicit meaning of the Mendic text. Anna, thank you. The shift in complexity, coupled with low self-perceived skills, often produce anxious reactions. Given that students are struggling with reading anxiety, it is important to explore ways to mitigate this anxiety. We know from the literature that collaborative reading with a partner or as a class, is effective to motivate students to foster a sense of community in the classroom and to dig deeper into issues raised in a text, as students have 1 or 25 sounding boards and access to a larger body of knowledge. So this is where my study comes in. There is no data on how collaborative reading is used in language learning as a means to lower anxiety. So my study aims to investigate this novel question. And unlike in other research on collaborative reading, in my study, students will be reading a text in their second, third, fourth language, and they will be reading synchronously. Let me now move to the original study design. So this fall, the project is implemented in a class of 18 students, 7 of which are participating in the study. We divided them into 2 subgroups. Group 1, experimental, we have 2 pairs of students who are meeting weekly on Teams or another platform of their choice to read together and log the number of minutes they spend reading. And at the end of the term, Jessica will be performing an exit interview and ask them questions about what types of interactions they were having. And then group 2 is a control group. They are working alone with the same text as the students reading in pairs. And I mediated the text myself. I added translations, some extra information needed for understanding. The study is running for 8 non-consecutive weeks. We will test the anxiety levels of students twice, one at the beginning and one at the end, so that we can compare the anxiety levels and see if it changed during the term. And every week students are reading a short text, they are doing a reading quiz, and we will compare the test scores and see if there's a correlation with their anxiety level towards the end of the term. Ironically, my students became anxious about participating in a study that aimed to reduce their anxiety. So that's why we implemented some tweaks to the original study design. And I will let Jessica in the next 2 minutes quickly explain what we did, what changes we implemented.
Okay, perfect. I'll be quick. So yeah, some students were hesitant to sign up for the study because they were worried about having to work with a partner and being able to find times to meet synchronously to read together, which of course is understandable given our current context. I'm sure we've all have experienced the pandemic wreaking havoc on our schedules and availability. So some students actually asked if they could choose the group that they would be in, which unfortunately is not possible given the importance of random assignment for the experimental study. But to reduce students' reservations about possibly being in the collaborative reading condition, we modified the study design so that participants in that condition could have some say in who their reading partner would be, as opposed to it being randomly assigned. So once we had that list of students who agreed to participate and who were assigned to the collaborative reading group, we allowed them to rank their preferences for potential partners, which we weren't overly concerned with instead of randomly assigning them, because this is pretty similar to what happens in a non-experimental teaching scenario where students often have the freedom to choose their partners for projects or assignments. And then one last change, since we had a later start to the study launch than we had anticipated, we reduced the number of texts that students read from 8 to 6, which shouldn't impact the study in any way, since participants are still getting to experience that collaborative reading. Yeah, so I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you. So this winter, I will be teaching Intermediate 2, hopefully on campus, fingers crossed. And another tweak that we are implementing is that the synchronous reading time will happen in class while students are with me. So I redesigned Intermediate 2 to be offered in a blended format. So instead of meeting twice a week, students will only meet once a week with me, but in a smaller group. So instead of 2 meetings with 40 students, they will have 1 meeting with 20 students. So hopefully it gives them more time and more space to speak and to interact with the language. And well, we will use the fact that my big group of students enrolled in Intermediate 2 is naturally split up into 2 smaller groups to assign one group as the control group and the other group as the experimental group. And we will do the activities in class. And I will do some more reading activities too in class now that I know that it's something that I should be focusing on too. And well, I'm confident that collaborative reading can be effective to mitigate foreign language reading anxiety levels in students. And I am looking forward to digging into the data of the pilot study at the end of December, beginning of January, before we start the study again this winter with Intermediate 2. And well, as a concluding note, I would like to repeat that I am very interested in feedback on the study design itself. ELE researchers, what have you done in the past? What would you do if you were me? Any type of input, feedback would be greatly appreciated. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias, Annik. Bueno, como me ha parecido súper interesante, pasaremos a las preguntas después de la última presentación. Voy a... La última presentación de esta sesión es por la doctora no sé si es Angela George.
Sí.
Sí, no Angela, muy bien. She's an associate professor of Spanish at the University of Calgary, where she teaches all levels of Spanish, including courses on Hispanic linguistics and language pedagogy courses. Her research focuses on the teaching and learning of Spanish. Her presentation today is titled Mixed Spanish Classes, Perceptions and Attitudes of Second and Heritage Language Learners. So thank you, Angela.
Thanks. Is this the right display? Can you see the screen without the notes? If someone could just say that out loud, I can't see any people.
We can
No,
we can see
Okay.
you can see the notes.
How about now?
better.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. Thanks again for having me. I came to this same conference in 2017 when it was in Ottawa. So I remember how lovely Ottawa was and probably still is. All right, so beginning Spanish courses are typically designed for students with no previous knowledge, particularly at the first semester. And in the beginning, most Spanish classes have been designed with this, but then we enter a situation where we also have heritage language learners that sometimes start in beginning Spanish and sometimes start in intermediate and advanced. But all of these Spanish courses historically have framed second language students as the ideal student, leaving out heritage speakers. But mixed classes are the most common instructional context in which heritage language learners study Spanish. And by this mixed classes, it just means heritage learners mixed in with other types of learners. And so mixed classes are here to stay, at least in North America. So just real quick, the definition of heritage speaker that I'll be using is that it's an individual who is raised in a home where a non-English or French, in this case, language is spoken, who speaks or merely understands the heritage language, and who is to some degree bilingual in English or French and the heritage language. So we talk about linguistic profiles. Hopefully this is this isn't new for anyone, but if it is, heritage language learners have strong oral skills, usually a good command of informal registers. They are good at spontaneous speech, especially in regards to everyday conversation. They have implicit knowledge of everyday speech. They have limited familiarity with formal registers. And when in the classroom context, they often focus on content when they're looking at materials. Then on the other hand, we have L2, which just means second language learners. They usually have stronger literacy skills, better command of formal registers, academic vocabularies, a term you might have heard. They often have explicit knowledge of grammar and the routines of language learning. I already said academic Spanish, and they tend, when you do classroom activities, they tend to focus more on the form or the structures as opposed to the content. So if we look at the previous research on mixed classes, heritage language learners often think that they have higher expectations from their teachers. They take Spanish to boost their grades. And they have also benefited from working with second language students, particularly with spelling and grammar explanations. They also make the class more diverse. They can be difficult to comprehend by other students in the class. Then we look at the research on second language learners. They benefit more from mixed classes. This is just two examples of research where this has been shown, but it's been shown in more. They're often more intimidated, especially by the heritage language learners in the class. In terms of advantages, even though they have more advantages, they often sometimes have unfair advantages, and they benefit from vocabulary, listening comprehension, and pronunciation from their heritage learner, or HS in this case is heritage speaker. I'll be using the term heritage speaker and heritage learner interchangeably. They also can slow the pace of the class down. And often they express that they have a decreased level of comfort when speaking. All right, so if we look at more of the studies on mixed language learners and perceptions of students towards these types of classes, Campanaro did a study in 2013 at the University of Alberta, looking at students in upper level Spanish courses, as well as some instructors. And she did find that the participants showed more positive perceptions than those in previous studies in the US. And again, more advantages for those second language learners compared to the heritage learners, and also that the students, second language learners, felt more intimidated. Asunción Delaney conducted a study in 2020 only with instructors of Spanish, and these were instructors of beginner Spanish, and talked about the advantages and disadvantages of mixed classes. So there were heritage speakers in the beginner level classes. And she specifically looked at the roles that teachers assign to heritage language learners. And they were often, probably not surprisingly, linguistic and cultural informants, pragmatic informants, translators and interpreters, tutors and helpers, but they were never input providers or providers of Spanish in that way. And then Lehman and Serafini, this is the last study I'll go over, conducted focus groups there were 2 groups with 3 to 4 heritage language learner students and 2 groups with only second language learner students. And they talked about their perceptions and attitudes towards mixed classes. And the findings showed that both groups have different kinds of cultural and linguistic knowledge. They talked about mutual benefits. And then they also, equity was an issue that came up a lot. They often said it was unfair for second language students. And this was said by both types of students, both second language and heritage speakers. And then for their perceptions of each other, the L2 students' perceptions was that they themselves have more academic Spanish, they use a more professional variety, they teach the grammar to the heritage learners, they're hard workers. The heritage learners, on the other hand, they just expect high grades without working hard, and Spanish comes naturally to the heritage learners. Then we look at the heritage learner perceptions, and they had the opportunity to review basic grammar. They were held to a higher standard. Their effort was not always awarded or appreciated. They viewed the second language students as a hindrance, and none of them mentioned learning from their second language peers. And again, these were all students in upper level Spanish classes at the university level. All right, so then that led into the goal for this study. So I don't know if you could gather this or not, but most of those studies that I just mentioned, they did not look at beginning learner students. One looked at teachers of beginning learners, but the others did not. So I wanted to gauge awareness towards these different types of learners, towards heritage speakers, second language learners, by beginners and also intermediate and advanced learners of Spanish. Due to that previous focus mainly being on the advanced learner or intermediate. All right, so the definitions I'll use for this study are and the participants saw this as well, are that the native speakers were born in the region or country where the language is spoken and moved after the age of 12. Heritage speakers then moved before the age of 12 or were born in Canada and grew up hearing and possibly speaking the language at home. Most of them did grow up speaking it at home. And late second language learners started learning the language at age 14 or later, and early was between the ages of 3 and 14. Okay, so there were 31 students. This was actually part of a much larger study that included more languages. But of all the students that responded, that were taking Spanish courses and that responded to all the questions, there were 31. 14 were taking beginner language courses or had just completed beginner language courses. 7 were in intermediate and 10 were in advanced. And then we can see here there were 10 late L2 learners in the beginners, 3 in intermediate, 6 in advanced. Unfortunately, there were only 2 heritage speakers total in the study, none in beginning, just 1 in intermediate and 1 in advanced, and 1 native speaker in advanced. And their motivation to take Spanish was to improve their bilingual skills. That was the most common. And others mentioned were to feel closer to their cultures, listen and watch TV, music, radio, and to talk to friends. All right, so then for the methods, I used a questionnaire that included questions on background and previous language experiences. Then I used 20 statements, where I'll get into that a little bit more soon, where they had to identify the types of learners. And then there were open-ended questions as well about their attitudes towards mixed classes, their feelings about mixed classes. There were also questions about willingness and comfort level interacting in Spanish, which I won't get into today. So I'm going to go over the results next, and this will include, like I said, the awareness of the types of learners that exist, like heritage speakers, native speakers versus second language learners, the percentages for students that were for and against mixed classes, and the feelings towards mixed classes. Okay, so this is what the participants saw was they would see one statement at a time. So number 1 typically speaks the language at home, and then they could select NS as native speaker, HS as heritage speaker, late L2 is late second language learner, early second language learner, unsure, or neither. So for every statement, they could select as many as they wanted. for these 9 statements, what the X represents is when 50% or more of the participants selected this learner type. And I did break it down into if the participants were in beginning, intermediate, or advanced Spanish classes. And so for these ones, it was 50% or more of learners at all levels selected native speaker or heritage speakers. So they were fairly aware of that native speakers and heritage speakers typically speak the language at home. They possess knowledge that isn't always valued in the classroom context. They have more firsthand experience and cultural knowledge. They have greater colloquial knowledge and slang, greater overall ability and fluency. Language comes more naturally. And for these 2, 5, and 6, only the beginning learners also chose early second language learners. For 5 and in 6, only the beginning and advanced learners chose language comes more naturally. For early second language learners, causes the class to be taught at a higher level, held to a higher standard, and brings linguistic and cultural expertise to the classroom. Okay, and then for the next set of statements, these were ones that where most of the participants selected native speakers and heritage speakers, although we do see a lot more variation. And in terms of the brings unfairness, so 11, 12, and 13 all have to do with unfairness in different ways. So in terms of abilities, in terms of expectations, and in terms of grading. And we do see that the advanced students also selected neither. So they were quite pleased, I guess, with in terms of equity, but some of the other ones were not. And then in this set of 3 statements, these were ones where all groups were selected. So they corresponded to both native speakers, heritage speakers, and learners. So benefits from exposure to cultural and linguistic diversity, benefits from listening to different dialects, benefits from their metalinguistic knowledge. Okay, and then the final set here was where mainly learners were selected. So typically learn the language primarily through the classroom. Not surprisingly, they all selected late and or early second language learners. Possesses more metalinguistic knowledge or ability to talk about the language, the same, both types of learners. Slows things down for the class. Late second language learners was selected, and effort isn't appreciated or rewarded, was only selected by intermediate students. Okay, so then if we look at the percentages that were for mixed classes, you can see the total there. 68% were for mixed classes and 32% against. So, and that's true whether they're in beginner, intermediate, or advanced classes. More students were in support of mixed classes than against. And so then we look at why. So they said if they were in support or not, and then they were asked to explain why. And so the late L2 learners said that they experienced speakers can help the others. They said everyone can learn from each other and that everyone needs an opportunity to practice. They mentioned learning how to speak from the heritage speakers. And then these last 3 for the late learners were that teachers should know the differences. Like, yes, there should be mixed classes, but only at the advanced levels. And again, these are all students in beginning classes saying this. And the other thought there should be a placement exam to determine ability levels. And then the early second language learners that were in beginning classes said that all can benefit from a healthy mix of learners. Early L2 learners can explain grammar to others. Heritage speakers can help with comprehension. Okay, thanks. And early L2 learners need a refresher, and heritage speakers and native speakers need to improve writing and rules. Okay, and so then we look at their feelings towards supporting mixed classes, and overall, they're very positive feelings. I actually put it through a linguistic inquiry word count, and the percentage of positive emotions was 5, and the percentage of negative emotions was 1.7. So you can see more positive, and the emotional tone was 84.5. And if that number is 100, then that means it's a very positive emotional tone. So you can see they were very much in support of having mixed classes. The second one here said they were a little bit daunted at first by having heritage and native speakers in the beginning language classroom, but then it motivated them to practice as well. And the ones early language learners said they had to tone down their level of knowledge so they wouldn't get called out and that sort of thing. So then the beginning students that were against the separate or the mixed classes, so that means they supported separate classes. So put the heritage speakers in one, put the learners in the other. The late L2 learners here that supported this said that there should be separate course to practice writing and vocabulary for the heritage speakers, which does show a high level of awareness of the needs of heritage speakers. Another said it was an unfair advantage for early second language learners. It rewards students who are already good at Spanish. It holds students to different standards. It's hard for students to speak in class, so that therefore separate classes would be better. And each group has different levels of knowledge. And then the early L2 learners said it was a waste of time for native speakers and heritage speakers to be in beginning language classes, and they could just be very distracting to others and affect participation. So then their feelings, and I put it through a linguistic inquiry word count, were more negative. Their emotional tone was only 4.6. And again, if it's out of 100, so 4.6 is really negative emotions here. And you can see their negative emotions was higher than their positive. So again, they said each skill level should have their own class so they can kind of understand their struggles. One felt very discouraged and like the class was more of a chore than an experience. They felt exhausted and anxious every day in class. Another said it made me feel like I want to be quiet because my knowledge is not at that level. And another said they felt uncomfortable. They were easily picked on when their pronunciation was off, and that the native and heritage learners try to hide what they know. So from the professor to kind of feel more like they fit into the class. And so they felt out of place. Okay, unfortunately, I'm not going to have time to go through the intermediate students and the advanced students, but that's okay. So the percentage of students for and against mixed classes in terms of their identity, unfortunately, there were only 3 native speakers and heritage learners. So they were all for mixed classes, and the late and early L2 learners as well. There was a bit of a mix with the late L2 learners, 58% for, so that's N equals 11 students, and 8 were against. And with the early L2 learners, 7 were for mixed classes and 2 were against. Okay, so then the discussion goes, most students did seem to support mixed classes. There was a lot of mention of mutual benefits, and there was some talk about making the class more authentic. The ones that were in support often talked about feeling intimidated, issues with comprehension, equity issues. There seems to be some understanding of the different types of learners. Issues of fairness did come up. They do think it's a little bit unfair for native speakers and heritage learners to be in the class. And what I am saying is I think students could benefit a little bit more from learning about the different types of learners. Some were really aware of it, but some weren't. And again, if we look at those emotions for supporting mixed classes, we can see the emotional tone was very close to 100 for the beginning students in beginning Spanish and advanced Spanish. So that means they had really strong positive emotions towards supporting mixed classes, except for the intermediate learners, they did not. And the feelings towards supporting supporting separate classes were really negative, and they were negative towards mixed classes. So they were very against these mixed classes. So students think heritage language learners should have an informant role. That was mentioned a lot, and just not in using that term, which was similar to teachers in a study in 2010. However, Burgo found that this could negatively impact the linguistic growth of heritage language learners, and it could undervalue the contributions and expertise of second language learners. So the implications that I came up with were it would be good to use differentiated instruction to discuss issues of fairness and to train teachers, but also students in these different types of learners in case teachers should know, but we all know they don't all know. Address linguistic insecurity in early second language learners and heritage speakers, because they are the ones that seem to have this the most. Recognize that all students can provide input. Use materials designed for mixed classes, and promote a curriculum that focuses on critical language awareness and that normalizes bilingualism and multilingualism and teaches about language awareness. I skipped that. I already said that pretty much. All right, so there's the works cited. And then I just wanted to say this, and I acknowledge the research assistant that helped work on this project.